Phenylketonuria, or simply PKU, is an autosomal recessive disease in which there's a problem in one of the enzymes involved in the metabolism of phenylalanine. Now, before we look at the details of this particular disease, let's take a look at the actual metabolism of phenylalanine as it takes place in normal individuals. So as we ingest food that is rich in protein, the protein is broken down into individual amino acids. And one of these amino acids is phenylalanine. Now, about 25% of the phenylalanine is actually used to build new proteins inside our cells. But the remaining 75% phenylalanine is used in the liver to actually generate another amino acid known as tyrosine. Now, tyrosine is also used to generate new protein because we need 20 amino acids to generate protein. But the remaining unused tyrosine inside the liver is metabolized via these steps into acetoacetate and fumarate. Now, acetoacetate is transformed into ketone bodies, and fumarate is transformed into glucose. And the cells of our body can use the ketone bodies and glucose for energy. So that's the normal process of metabolism of phenylalanine as it takes place inside our body. Now, what's the problem in patients with PKU? Well, by definition, phenylketonuria basically means high levels of phenylketone, also known as phenylpyruvate, in our urine. Now, where do we get phenylketone from? Well, when we have accumulation of phenylalanine inside our body, that phenylalanine is transformed into phenylketone, also called phenylpyruvate. And so we see that the problem in these patients is elevated levels of phenylalanine. And the only way that we elevate levels of this molecule is if this reaction does not take place at a high enough rate. And that's exactly what the problem is in patients with PKU. The problem is within this step. So we have phenylalanine that is transformed into tyrosine by this enzyme. So phenylalanine hydroxylase is a mixed function oxygenase that uses a cofactor known as tetrahydrobiopterin. Now, this is not a vitamin. It's a cofactor that is built inside our cells, inside our body. So if there's a problem within this enzyme itself, or there's a problem in actually building this cofactor, this reaction will not take place. And so the person will develop phenylketonuria. Now, the most common cause of phenylketonuria is a defect in this enzyme. And this is an autosomal recessive disease. What that means is the patient, to have PKU, has to get a defective gene from the male parent and a defective gene from the female parent to actually develop symptoms of phenylketonuria. So carriers of this disease essentially grow up to be normal. Now, if we have high levels of phenylalanine, what will that cause? Well, high levels of phenylalanine will essentially affect the myelination of the neurons inside our body, inside our brain. And so high levels of phenylalanine will essentially cause defects in brain development. In fact, people with PKU have low IQs. Now, this is a very dangerous condition if not treated. In fact, about half the patients with PKU who are not treated die before the age of 20. And about 75% of the patients that are not treated die before the age of 30. However, if we treat this condition early on and continue the treatment throughout the lifetime of the individual, that individual will essentially grow to be normal. Now, how do we treat this problem? Well, essentially, the patient that has PKU before birth, they have no problems. Why? Well, because the mother has the enzyme to actually catalyze this step. And so any phenylalanine within the mother will be transformed into tyrosine. Now, following birth, there's also no problem. Why? Because that patient has not yet ingested protein rich in phenylalanine. But as soon as that patient is born and then is fed, they essentially obtain the protein, break down the protein into phenylalanine, and then they cannot transform the phenylalanine into tyrosine. So now this phenylalanine will begin to essentially accumulate within the blood and tissue of that patient. And so this is precisely how we can actually diagnose a patient with PKU. Because patients with PKU after birth and following the first feeding cycle will have levels of phenylalanine that are 20 times higher than those of normal patients that don't have PKU. So by drawing blood and finding high levels of phenylalanine in that infant, we essentially can diagnose that infant with PKU. Now, how do we treat this patient with PKU? Well, essentially, we have to limit protein intake, and we limit specifically phenylalanine. So we give just enough phenylalanine for that patient to be able to build new protein, but we have to limit that phenylalanine because the patient can transform that phenylalanine to tyrosine. So to summarize, phenylketonuria is essentially a condition in which we find very high levels of phenylketones inside our urine. Why? Well, the problem lies within this step. Usually there's a defect in this enzyme, phenylalanine hydroxylase, so we can't transform phenylalanine into tyrosine. And so we're going to build up phenylalanine inside that individual. The phenylalanine will be transformed into phenylpyruvate, also known as phenylketone, and that will begin to appear within that urine of that patient.